Good morning, everybody. This is today's lecture. In lieu of driving to class, I hope that you checked your email and saw that there was no class being held on campus, for me at least today, to avoid commuting in the snow and ice. This lecture will cover the material we were supposed to cover in class today, and so be advised you are responsible for everything posted in this lecture. We will briefly discuss this material in class on Wednesday and then move along to our next subject, which will be animal body and also the preference. We will spend an additional amount of time Wednesday focusing on lab materials, including the vertebrate skeletal system, the taxonomy that we will be covering today, and making time for the taxonomy we'll cover on Wednesday. As you go through this lecture, I would encourage you, please make stars next to anything that you have questions about or is not perfectly clear so that we can really get in and figure out what's not understood. As always, I'm happy to answer your questions by email or in class or during my office hours, so don't hesitate to stop by. Well, let's go ahead and get started. And so today we're going to be talking about animal classification and phylogeny. And so classification, the reason, and guys, I apologize, there's a dog in here with me, so you're going to get some ambient noise. But when we talk about classification, guys, the reason we classify animals into these various groups, and really all organisms, is so that we can get a better understanding of them. And that understanding is going to lead to phylogenetic understanding, and that's really what we're after. And so guys, phylogeny focuses on evolutionary relationships between organisms in so much as trying to define or determine a common ancestor for these groups. And so consider last week when we were looking at the phylogenetic tree of modern dogs, we traced that pattern from the golden retrievers and the sheepdogs and the Rottweilers we're familiar with today, all the way through that branching diagram back to something very close to our modern gray wolves. And that common ancestor is going to help us determine how that diversification or how those splits occur. And so phylogeny seeks to understand evolutionary relationships. Now, when we look at the diversity of life on the planet, we see that zoologists and biologists have described approximately 1.6 million species. Now, that's a lot of information and a lot of organisms out there to be looking at, but we find that most of those that we're going to focus on are animals. They represent about 3/4 of that 1.6 million species, or 75%. Now, whenever we look at the ones that have been identified, what we're talking about is that they've been named, they've been studied, they've been grouped, and they've been classified, characterized. We know a lot about them. Now, that 75% of 1.6 million seems like a lot, but in all, that's only about 1% of the total 30 million estimated undescribed species that have ever lived on our planet. And so there's a lot out there that we still don't know and don't understand, right? So less than 1% of all the species that of animals that have ever lived. Now, when we look at classification systems, taxonomy is the science of naming and classifying organisms. And so this is where we start our taxonomic survey of the animal kingdom. And so we're going to be going through this various groups and identifying their taxonomic rankings. We're going to spend a lot of time doing this, so please understand taxonomy is the science of naming and classifying organisms. We're going to name and classify organisms so that we can group them appropriately, as you see here with all the various butterflies identified, but also it helps us understand these organisms and how they may be beneficial to us. Now, when we look at something, and I'm going to go back one slide, when we look at this animal here, dog, this is a mastiff, a type of dog, we'll talk about why common names aren't necessarily the best way to go. And so what's wrong with common names? Well, consider this example. Here you have a jellyfish, a crayfish, and a silverfish. The problem with the common names is that none of these is really actually a fish. And so these common names lead to confusion among individuals, particularly individuals of different languages or of different cultures, because the common names can be misleading. And they're also very regional in many cases. If you consider, for example, this animal, the crayfish, many of you may know them as crawdads or crawdaddies or mud puppies or a number of different other names depending on where you're from and what you've grown up having these called in your particular family. And so common names they lead to confusion. And so in science, we like to be more specific and more exact with our terminology. And so we're going to use what's called a natural system of classification, and one that's going to name these organisms uniquely to avoid that confusion. Now, a natural system of classification is one that's going to remove human influence, and so it reflects relationships in nature without human perspective or human bias playing in to that particular classification ranking. We're going to base our natural system of classification on homologies, and we talked about homologies in class last time. Homologies are similarities in structure or molecular sequences, such as those that we examined in the mammalian forelimb. And so based on this arrangement and this pattern of bone structure, we can determine that all of these organisms at some point shared a common ancestor because they have that same pattern of skeletal system. Now, our taxonomic structure or ranking system was developed by a man named Carolus Linnaeus. His real name was actually Carl von Linné, and he was a botanist in the late 1800s in Sweden. And he saw that there were all these competing systems of taxonomy and these naming systems that were prevalent. And remember, we talked about Aristotle, who was prominent about 500 BC. Well, since Aristotle, there had been a number of individuals that had followed suit after him in terms of naming and describing various organisms. The problem is that you had people who specialized like in woody shrubs and trees, and then someone else who would specialize just in sea animals or just in mammals of their particular country. And so you had all these different naming systems, and people were trying to communicate with one another, and there was just a lot of ambiguity. And so Carolus Linnaeus came in, and he wanted to make a cohesive system that would bring together all of these different strings of classification and make one coherent system that we still use today. And so it was a very well done system and a very accurate one, and one that we rely on because of how logical it was. Now, when you talk about dedication to your field, the interesting thing about Linnaeus is that while he was born Carl von Linné, the names that he assigned to his organisms, he actually ended up applying to his own name. And so that's where we get the name Linnaeus from. It's a Latinized version of his name, Linné. And so he developed a unique two-part name for each type of organism that he encountered and that had been described before him, and he created what's called binomial nomenclature. And so in his particular form of taxonomy, he created this hierarchy, and the hierarchies were a system where each level is more specific than the one above it. So here we see that vertebrates, everything that has a backbone. Well, the next level down, this taxon mammalia, or taxon, I should say, excuse me, that's the singular. Well, the taxon mammalia is more specific because here we're only going to find the mammals, not the birds, not the reptiles, not the amphibians, only the mammals that are in this group of vertebrates. But even more specifically, we move to our next taxon, the carnivores. Well, carnivora is more specific in the mammalian group because here we find things like our jaguar. But even in the carnivores, which includes things like cats and the canids, the dog species, and bears, we want to look specifically just at the cats. And so here we see the group Felidae. Well, that's even more specific than the carnivores generally. And so this hierarchy develops where we go from something very broad up here to something very specific down at the bottom. We're going to make these classifications and groupings based on shared characteristics. And when we talk about shared characteristics, again, we're looking at shared characteristics in morphology or body form, and also molecular homologies, similarities in molecular sequences. Okay, so like we looked at with the protein example in the lecture last week, where you had a certain percentage of amino acids that were the same, well, that's a molecular homology whenever we're looking at, for example, humans and chickens that were 69% similar, or humans and the rhesus monkeys, which were 95% similar. And so that gives us understanding about which taxon these groups should be located in. Now, again, the whole point of this is to help us focus on phylogeny or understand evolutionary relationships. And so whenever we look at this image here, you have a super cute little bluebird over here. And the question is, okay, based on evolutionary history, who is this bird more closely related to? Well, many people think bats because of their shared body form or their common morphology. But what we actually see is that birds are direct descendants of crocodiles and even the living dinosaurs that are persisting today. We know that because of a molecular homology, among other features, that show us that the protein in bird feathers is almost identical to the keratin protein found in the skin of reptiles. And so if you think about an alligator or a crocodile, that real kind of tough keratin protein that's going to feel those scales on the skin and make them really tough and hard to penetrate. That shows up in birds, and so that's interesting because you say, okay, well, why? Well, the reason is because they share some evolutionary ancestor, some common ancestor. When we get to our bird lecture, we'll talk more specifically about other homologies we see in body form or morphology between these two groups, the birds and the reptiles. And in classification systems, we're seeing that in many systems, birds are being grouped into the group with reptiles or class Reptilia. And so we'll talk about that more as we go. All right. Now, when we look at our hierarchical system of classification, what we see is that there are 8 taxa that organisms are grouped into. You are responsible for knowing all 8 of these taxa in order from broadest, the domain level, to most specific, the species level of classification. How do we remember this? Well, you have domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. I'm a fan of rote memorization, but if that doesn't work for you, we always have acronyms. And so here you have DKPCOFGS. Dumb King Philip came over for great spaghetti. If you can remember that phrase, you can remember the order that these taxa go in. And so hopefully you'll be able to get that right on upcoming quizzes and the exam. Right? And so now let's look at why scientific names are so important. And so whenever we think of a squirrel, many of us think of different things. You may think of something like the rock squirrel or the 13-line ground squirrel, depending on what you're more familiar with. But again, common names are not going to be good enough. Of course, there's the flying squirrel. So what we see is that Linnaeus came up with what's called binomial nomenclature. And binomial means bi for two, nomial for name, two-part name to name the organism. Right? This two-part name is unique to every different species. And there's 2 parts to it. The first part is the genus, which is the lowest general taxa level. And we also get the species. The species is a unique descriptive word about that particular species or that particular group. Right? So genus is first, it's always capitalized, and it's the lowest general taxa level. Species is second, and it's a descriptive word about that particular group of organisms. And so when we look at humans, for example, the human binomial is Homo sapiens. Homo for the genus that contains all of the hominids or bipedal primates. Sapiens is our descriptive word, and whenever Linnaeus assigned that to human beings, that comes from a word meaning wise, and he hoped that we would be wise men. Right? Now, you'll notice on your notes as you're looking at them that the binomial is always printed in italics, and that's because they are Latinized. Right? And so anytime you write something in another language, we're going to write it in italics to indicate that it is in a different language. Now, guys, an interesting discussion, why use Latin? Well, Latin is a dead language, and so it's not affected by politics, and you're not getting words like amazeballs or bootylicious or anything like that added to it, like we do to English or even other languages as well. And so it's very structured, and it's not going to change a whole lot. And so that's the reason we use Latinized terms even today. And even if you went out and discovered a new animal, you would convert that into a Latin term so that it was cohesive with this style of nomenclature. Right? And so when we look at human beings, there it is at the bottom, Homo sapiens. And there's a couple things I want you to notice about this binomial. First of all, you have the genus classification first. That's the lowest general taxon here. But notice the genus is always capitalized, the first letter. And so that first letter will always be capitalized. Everything else is lowercase. Okay. Now, the whole thing is set in italics because it is Latinized. All right, so that's what a binomial should look like. If we wanted to abbreviate our binomial, say we were comparing multiple groups within the same genus, the Homo genus, what we would do is abbreviate that first letter of the genus. And so H period sapiens would be used in comparative studies.